The altar of sacrifice had one purpose, and that was to deal with sin. Animal sacrifice is a tricky subject to discuss with children, but they must have a general understanding in order to begin comprehending why Jesus had to die on the cross for them. In this video, I will give you some specific wording as you broach this topic with your students, and then provide some ideas for making your own tabernacle altar of sacrifice for students to touch and see. I will give you several unique ideas on how you can make small, medium, and large versions. Please join us. It is important that students understand what sin is and its serious consequences. I usually start by saying something like this. The Bible tells us that everyone, you, me, your parents, everyone has sinned. The word sin was an archery term. It was what scorekeepers yelled when an arrow missed the bullseye, the center of the target. At this point, reveal a target. It could be a magnetic dartboard or a paper target and a soft ball. Just don't use anything sharp. Find a couple of students and stand them sufficiently away from the target so that they are unlikely to hit the center. When students miss, yell, "Sin!" or "That's a miss!" Then say something like this. Sin means to miss the mark, to miss the center of the target. You may not mean to miss the center, but you still miss the center. And this is what sin is, missing the mark of perfection. I have never met a person who didn't lie or who didn't demand their own way, have you? That leaves us with a big problem because the Bible tells us that the cost of sin is separation from God. I have good news. God loves you and me way too much to leave us separated from Him. The bad news is that the cost of sin is death, the payment that needs to be made to have a relationship with God. The good news is that God loved His people so much that in the days of the tabernacle, there was a system in place where an animal, who didn't deserve to die, could take the place of a person. Let's call this person Mr. Sinner. At this point, hold up a stuffed animal. A sheep or a goat would be ideal, but any animal will do. And then say, I want to assure you that we don't do animal sacrifices anymore. And there is a very good reason for this. Stick with me and I'll explain why this good news gets even better. The animal brought to be sacrificed had to be perfect. It couldn't be sick or injured or missing an ear. It had to be the animal that you would want to keep. This animal would take the place of Mr. Sinner who wants forgiveness from God. Instead of Mr. Sinner dying, God allowed the animal to die in his place. The blood of this animal brought Mr. Sinner back into a relationship with God. I guess we could call him Mr. Forgiven now. But unfortunately, it was only temporary, because as soon as Mr. Forgiven sinned again, his name changes back to Mr. Sinner, and he has to bring another animal to the altar. This is a never-ending cycle. Good thing that this process wasn't God's final solution. Have your students open up their Bibles to Hebrews 2:17 and read the second part of the verse together. Our merciful and faithful high priest before God, he could offer a sacrifice that would take away the sins of the people. Jesus is the high priest, the one that offered sacrifices on behalf of the people and the sacrifice. Jesus, the perfect Lamb of God, died on the cross and totally paid our sin debt. If your students ask, please assure them that humans were never sacrificed on the altar. God values human life too much for that. That God allowed His Son to die in our place is a great mystery, but should remove any doubt in your students' minds that they are loved. Tabernacle furniture pieces can be difficult for adults, let alone children, to visualize. Having something to show students is so important. If you have the time, money, and skilled labor to make a full-size altar, I have some helpful hints toward the end of the video. For those of you looking for smaller versions, I have ideas aplenty for you too. Whichever one you choose to make, here are the basics. The bronze altar was 4.5 feet tall and 7.5 feet wide and long, a square, and it had the distinction of being the largest piece of furniture in the tabernacle. The altar of sacrifice was made of acacia wood, a heavily ringed wood, and a very pretty color. It is an expensive wood still used in making fine furniture today. I have 3 suggestions for making your own altar to give your students an active way of grasping this concept. If you look at thrift stores or garage sales, you will likely run across a small hibachi charcoal grill. These are great because they're usually square or rectangular, and since they are metal, they can be spray painted. Another idea is to find an oven rack or a baking cooling rack and place it on top of a box. A raised garden bed is another great alternative. Some kits have panels that slide together, and you can configure them to any shape you wish. 2 stacked sets would give it even more depth. Search raised garden bed online and you will see a whole host of options, some of which are even the correct color of bronze. This is a simple and fairly inexpensive option. Kids have to use their imagination for this one, but it gets them involved in a way that they won't forget. Before class, measure out a 7.5-foot square on the floor and place masking tape markers at the corners. With a measuring tape in hand, have all your students stand up and find 4 students who are the closest in height to 48 inches, the height of the altar. These 4 students will stand at the corners so that your class can see the height, width, and length of the altar. If you have a carpenter available to you, there is nothing like having a full or half-size altar for your students to sit around as you discuss the sacrifice that Christ made on their behalf. I've never made a full-size altar, but I had a half-sized one made, so I can provide some guidance from that experience. First, be aware that a 7.5-foot box takes up a great deal of real estate. It is larger than you think. I had my half-size altar made so that it could fold flat. This is essentially in 2 pieces with hinges keeping 2 sides together. For the grating, we used steel grating used by the construction industry to reinforce cement. 2 offset stacked layers reduces the size of the holes. These horns were hand carved and, with the help of a dowel, slipped down into corner holes for stability. Triangular wooden corner pieces work perfectly fine too. You probably won't have your kids carrying around this altar, so while you do need large enough poles to make it look realistic, these would not have to be wood. Save yourself some money and cut 2-inch PVC to size and spray paint it bronze. Whichever option you choose, your students will not forget this lesson on sin, redemption, and salvation. And it all centers around the altar of sacrifice and the sacrifice that was made for us. This is Becky from Experience the Bible Creatively, reminding you that props are always better than paper.